What we like when the hallway's a bit dark is we get a sense of hope down the end of the hallway there, because there's light coming from that end, which I like. Because I do think that in a way these tunnels are the dark passageways of human experience.
Yes, I could tell you some stories. The question is, can they be verified?
Sometimes I'm up and sometimes I'm down. Glory, hallelujah.
You must never look like a patient, or else people will judge you, scrutinize you, observe you intently to see if you are crazy. Crazy. I'm not supposed to use that word in here. It's all kinds of connotations. I'm telling you, listen, I use that word, all right? All right.
It's fun to see the reaction of people seeing the building for the first time, because it is a terribly evocative building, and a building that just feeds your imagination and makes you want to respond to it in creative or artistic ways.
When we arrived, there was no one here. Andy was supposed to meet us, but we had no idea where he was. And the door was open that one creepy inch. Didn't turn on any lights, and we found ways into the basement. Then you see your room, and you're like, oh, this must be the room where this and this and this happened. And you get to sort of let your imagination go crazy. And I loved it. I thought it was great.
And I'm walking through this incredible building and feeling these feelings. It's like I've called it ghosts before, and I know it's not ghosts, but it's like everywhere you look, there's these stories that are just like coming at you.
And as I drove up the long driveway, I was saying, so this is the mental hospital. And then touring through it, I couldn't get over all of the abandonment and darkness I felt about the room.
This place may remain vacant until it's demolished. For the historic sense and purpose of this, I hope that doesn't happen. But it's also an extremely expensive building to maintain.
A building at a transitional period in its life, in decline or decay, seems to exude the stories or give up the stories that are embedded in it. Site-specific theatre works with the history, the archived history, and the legends and myths and oral history that comes out of these particular sites.
This door is interesting because you've got this peephole that was used to check the well-being of the patient. All these marks tell a story, really. Even the cracks or the way the paint peels can be metaphors for aging and how time has changed this space and how our relationship to public health care has changed and changing attitudes towards the mentally ill.
They collected things for the book that they did on the history of the mental hospital.
Right.
So they selected some of the documents that were probably more interesting.
Mentally ill persons at one time were thought to possess evil spirits and demons. In the past 20 years or so, progress has been made in the treatment of emotionally ill. First came insulin electro-shock, dramatic, rapid methods of bringing depressed or insane patients to a point where they can be helped by trained psychiatric doctors and nurses.
I think society was very afraid of emotional disorder. They didn't know what it meant. Were they obsessed with something? Was there some evil spirit making them do this? And I think in the 1930s and 40s, a lot of society felt that way about emotionally disturbed people. They were very afraid of them. And the other thing was to put them out of sight, out of mind. And quite often you would find psychiatric hospitals outside of small towns, much like Weyburn was.
That 1921 when it was built. What stays in my mind mostly is driving around in my father's old McLaughlin Buick, and when the building was finished, and of course there was no trees, there was nothing around it, except the road. And I can remember the patients out walking around, and one of them would come up to the car and talk to us, and I can remember that. That was quite vivid. I think probably I was a little bit nervous, because at that time the mentally ill were not accepted the way they are now.
Saskatchewan Hospital, then called the Mental Hospital, was one of the few places veterans found work. So I came to work in Mental Hospital in Weyburn. I was very apprehensive. I hadn't actually been in this building before, and I walked around. It's over a mile around it, and people were putting their heads through the window, and some of the kids were screaming, and I thought, well, I don't know if I'm going to like this.
My dad died. About 3 years later, my mother said she was getting married. I couldn't figure out who could she be marrying. There was just this old carpenter guy coming around once in a while. She says, well, that's the guy. He said, these kids have got to go. She said, either they go or he goes. So my one sister went and lived with her grandmother, and then it was about a week later they said that I'm going into the Weyburn area with some boys with a farm and horses and stuff like that. And so my grandmother brought me out here July the 5th, 1944, and it was Wednesday and it was raining out. Well, he came back a year later and said hello again,
We actually admitted children here who ended, and there are some historical information that some children stayed here for 20, 30 years.
My first memory is really just coming in and wondering why the patients weren't wearing clothes and why there were so many people all in one place.
Well, I came in 1964, and of course that was the year I graduated from high school, and I was quite interested in this psychiatric nursing. I thought, oh wow, I mean this is really something, and of course I was going to help all these people, so off I came here to Weyburn. And I always said if I had a means to leave after the first day that I went on to a unit, I probably would have left.
I just feel so trapped. I was first really scared of the environment, like a lot of the other performers and the other artists. I couldn't be in here by myself. But now I've settled into it the way a nurse my age back in the day might have gotten used to it.
Well, you entered the building in a beautiful marble staircase, and it had brass railings. And so your perception when you first enter the building is sterile, and you can even smell how sterile the facility was. And then you would go down the corridors to enter into the lock units, many, many lock units at that time. And the closer you got, the more you might smell and have a sense that there's something on the other side of those locked doors. And when you would go through those locked doors, depending whether you're on some of the psychogeriatric units, there would be a real smell of urine, a real smell of feces.
And there's a smell of 1,000 different lives in this place. That's the one thing I've noticed. It's not just a stale building. You can smell that things have happened in here.
The first unit that I worked on was in the basement. And to get to the unit that I worked on, I had to walk through a unit where the very severely mentally handicapped people lived. And of course on that unit, I mean, they were all males, and half of them were naked, and they were lying around the floor, and I mean, there was urine and whatever else around, and I was carrying this big key and had to put it into the door to get to the unit on the other side. And I mean, to get through that unit was just like, am I going to get through alive? Because, you know, you'd look around, there are men following you, men with no clothes on. So it was pretty traumatic.
I don't really remember coming into the building, but I guess I got in there, and it was put on, I thought it was 4B or something like that for newcomers, eh? And then all there was spittoons on the floor and tobacco butts just laying all over, and then and I was wondering, what the heck am I doing here? There's no kids here or nothing like that. So this year one guy came up to me had a white coat on. He says, you have to do what we tell you to do from now on. We're like your parents. This is your home. So you do what we say and everything will be fine.
This was also a shelter for the underprivileged and the unwanted, because it's a government institution, eh? So they had no other place to go, so they came here.
Yeah, this was the dormitory.
Oh, you guys could film in here.
Yeah. And it's still very similar. It's nice and warm in here, too. And my bed was right here. This was where my bed was.
Oh, okay.
First got here within 5 days. That was when they put you in. Seemed like it was a hospital ward area, but anyway, you're sort of in bed. Then all of a sudden, then you started. Then these guys just started running their hands over you under the cover. What the heck's going on here? And I knew then. The perverts were all, I realized the place was just loaded down with pedophiles, but they had no name for them. I just knew that. I never had anybody bothering me before. And then, I didn't know nothing about oral sex and all that, but I sure had enough of that, eh? I'd say I had oral sex at least 3 or 4 times a week, and that's for the whole time, eh? What's a 10-year-old going to do to somebody that's 200 pounds? You can't do nothing.
This is my nightmare. I am covered with hands. They take hold of different parts of my body, staking out their territory.
I was amazed and became educated in how the mentally ill were labeled, stigmatized by being labeled with derogatory names.
Imbeciles!
When a new patient was admitted, they would have a panel discussion, decide what unit he should go on. So the poor guy was sitting in the center and 12 psychiatrists around. So one psychiatrist say, oh, I think I can't get anything out of him. He must be an idiot. Another psychiatrist say, no, I heard him. He said 2 or 3 sentences and he made some sense. Oh, they all agreed he must be a moron.
Morons!
There was one time there was about 10 or 12, I don't know if they're doctors or who they were, and they're reading off all this here stuff, and none of it made any sense. They, to me, said that I played with dolls or whatever, eh? But on our block, all there was girls.
If I was to flick a switch 7 times, the next number I would have to flick it is 21 times. And then the next number after that is 101. I have no idea how I created this in my head. I have obsessive compulsive disorder and I suffer from panic attacks. Most of my artwork deals with issues of mental illness.
And there was one individual I remember that took 3 steps forward and then forward backward, and couldn't make it to lunch, breakfast, or supper.
But in order to have a proper connection, one needs to introduce himself. So let me introduce myself, all right? I will introduce myself now. I am Dr. Disappointment. Hello, everyone.
We also had a staff member, a very bright young PhD. Sometimes I'd go into his office, and I would go leave his office, and he'd pull a handkerchief out, and he'd wipe the chair I was sitting on, and then he'd wipe the doorknob I put my hand on. And, I mean, this man had a wife and kid and actually ended up being in a psych hospital himself as a client.
You know, I have always maintained
that psychiatric nursing is an art loosely related to the actor's art. The warmth, the spontaneity, the humanity, and the intuition are really carefully calculated reactions based on a wide knowledge of mental illness and the needs of individual patients.
Acting is very much like that. It relates quite well to maybe some of the people that were in this space that never quite knew who they were or what they were doing.
They're getting a whole bunch of artists together, artists from all over the board, like theater, music, visual arts, all that, and really putting them together to be able to talk about this issue, talk about the hospital and the whole idea of madness. A lot of people see art as being closely related to it just because of the fact that artists have always been thought of as being outside of the norm. There's that guy that did all the murals, and they say that possibly he was put in just because he wouldn't stop painting. And that's pretty bad. I know a lot of people that would probably be put in this place if that was the reason.
Well, I think we are making a big statement about the thin line between the patients and the workers, and how it was basically just this label that you are insane and you work here, so you have to be sane. Where a lot of the stories show differently.
We'd hear people from uptown, you know, businessmen. They said, well, you guys working up at the mental hospital, the only way we can tell the difference between you and the patients, you're carrying keys, you know.
Because women were so housebound, horse and carriage being the main source of transportation, men did most of the communicating on behalf of the family. So a man could go to town to pick up the mail and supplies, and the next thing his wife knew, she was being shipped off to Weyburn.
There were people who admitted here that actually weren't psychotic, that might have had some difficulty with their family or difficulty with society, but somebody would swear a commitment with a judge, and that individual would be admitted. And then they would get institutionalized, and they would stay for a long time.
Well, it really was a catch-all place because, you know, over the years, you not only had people with mental illness, like depressions and schizophrenia, but the mentally handicapped. The mentally handicapped came here. Alcoholics were sent here. Epileptics, people with epilepsy, but really didn't have a whole lot of other problems, they were sent here.
I know she's epileptic. I just thought if I tied her down, maybe she'd try and hold it in for once. I mean, why do we even have these anyway?
We're trying to evoke a sense of the young psychiatric nursing staff who were working here primarily between the 20s to the late 40s, before the advent of tranquilizers and drugs. So I'm kind of looking at this space here, wondering how we evoke the sense of their job routine, which was extremely busy. In those days, the hospital was overcrowded with patients. So the nurses were constantly having to deal with more and more and more demands on their time.
It was so crowded that we had to set up beds in the dining rooms, in the dining areas. And perhaps we could put about 100 beds in each dining room. In the dormitories, it was so crowded that we couldn't walk between the beds, so we had to walk on top of the beds. And we'd go from one bed to another to wake the patients in the morning.
After Kathleen told me that story about when they allowed patients out into the grounds, that one of the first things they did was make some little shelters for themselves, I started thinking, yeah, I'm sure they would if there was so many people in here with so much constant stimulation.
I'm enjoying making by hand all the ribs of this thing. And so in addition to a hut, it's like an upturned boat, and it speaks about the journey that these individuals, whoever they were in this institution, were on. And, you know,
I mean, we're all here many, many years later trying to imagine what their experience was. We can read about it, we can hear about it, but we can never be inside their souls and their hearts as they lived out this experience.
I would say maybe the better ones, the ones that were allowed outside, they'd go out in the trees and they'd cut down branches and they'd make these type of shelters, and they would spend most of the day there. And they were kind of what they called the outside free living.
Nurses and attendants are to remain in their wards unless and when and if their duties require them to leave their ward, and then they must have the consent of their supervisor. Shout, "Bedtime, gentlemen." 2 nurses stand at one door and 2 at the other door. Make sure that the gentlemen take off their dirty clothes and put on a nightshirt before going to bed. This could be a time of fist fights and hair pulling. More sedatives by needle.
I mean, it's like the color scheme. As soon as you take these colors and you do some test to figure out, okay, if you put someone in this kind of room, that'll make them calmer, or, you know, all the ideas that sort of go into that kind of color theory. And yet, as you make it an institution, then all of a sudden everyone hates these colors. And the colors sort of, you've instantly kind of changed that feeling of sort of serenity or whatever that color was supposed to do, and now you've made it this kind of institution. So the color is sort of a great kind of example of the way that idea of having an institution devoted to helping people, and yet at the same time, as soon as it gets to this scale with all of these sort of problems about people and about running it and about how many people are here and the sort of individuality of all the problems, all of a sudden you run into, you know, how crazy the institution sort of idea is.
The whole thing was control. It was amazing. It was run under a military system where it was a place for everybody and everybody in its place. There was hardly any bickering. You knew exactly where you fit in the system. So therefore, you didn't step out of line. If you did, you were controlled, which all people want to be controlled.
The nurses were immaculately dressed in uniforms that were all starched, the bibs. I don't know if you remember the bibs with their hats. There's tremendous cadre of professionalism that doesn't exist anymore in the healthcare system. There are some cultural things that I actually agreed with. When the head nurse came in, I stood up.
It was quite regimented because they were trying to maintain some kind of order out of chaos. Making sure that their physical needs were met were very important, and it was not easy to do that because they had to truck all the food way down from the kitchen down to A floor, and a lot of people needed to be fed and their beds had to be changed. Every now and again there'd be an outbreak of dysentery, and so you knew how to do that, but you didn't know how to really be helpful to individual people.
You can't write to anybody because all your mail is intercepted, coming and going. You can't use telephones, or you're not allowed to,
Employees must not correspond with friends or relatives of patients and must refer all letters or inquiries to the superintendent.
That superintendent was a psychiatrist. That individual was your chief executive officer. That individual had a tremendous amount of power.
Maybe it's a little bit along the lines that some of the supervisors here in the older days, like before the 50s, they used to relish their power. A lot of the mechanisms in place were about shame and fear, making you fearful that you'd lose your job, and making you feel ashamed of not being able to cut the mustard.
She's afraid of him, so that really ties into shame and fear. She's ashamed of herself, and she's afraid of the patients.
And I admit, there is a feeling in some parts of the institution that they should be doing something for their keep.
But they mainly repaired watches for the staff,
So the patients did do a fair shake of the work, didn't they?
Oh yeah, the staff didn't do much. I figured, why should I be making all these beds for these people? Because they're supposed to be doing it. I didn't have to do it because they didn't want to, but I just felt that I got to keep moving, eh? Because otherwise you start losing your mind or something, I guess.
You know, there was the laundry in the farm, and the people worked in the diet office, and they worked helping with the cafeteria, and they all had jobs, sort of thing. They had a sense of belonging, and this was their home.
And I think that while they had animals, they had a dairy farm out there, and so of course you had a milk supply, you had an egg supply, you had the gardens that supplied food for the facility here. I think there was a little bit of politics to have these work gangs, because then it served the purpose of the facility.
The only problem is some got good at their job. I know somebody was out at they had 500 pigs and chick, and they got good at it out there. Well, they're a little reluctant to discharge them,
The philosophy of the station was you would play records on the air the way you played music for your friends in your home, which is, alternate cuts. It's, several versions of the same song. Oh, listen, this is how Janis does it. This is how Big Mama Thornton does it, and this is how Blind Lemon Jefferson did it, 50 years ago. And then you could play all 3 cuts of the same song. And if you wanted to play a 14-minute cut while you went to the bathroom or got a sandwich, you could do that too.
Tom always said he wanted a radio station that sounded like you were in the living room of a friend who had the most amazing stereo system imaginable and a tremendous collection of records and impeccable taste.